Hey, greetings, everyone. Salamat, marhaba. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to Hamle for organizing the 2023 PDAF. So I'm excited for the conversation today. My name is Ahmed Nabil Abu Znaid, and I'm the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights Executive Director. Happy to be a part of this conversation today. I'd first like to ask each of my panelists to just briefly introduce themselves. I think it'd be great to just state your current title and your name for everyone. And if you'd like to add where you're dialing in from, that'd be helpful as well. Inez, I'm going to hand off to you first to introduce yourself, and then we'll get to Gaia and Fadi.
Hi, Ahmed. It's good to be with you all, and it's good to be at PDAF, and thank you for the invite. My name is Ines Abdelaze. I'm the director of the PIPD, the Palestine Institute for Public Diplomacy, also known as Rabit on social media, and happy to be here.
Thank you, Inez. Gaia, please take a second and introduce yourself to everyone.
Hi, I'm sorry, I'm having a full tech meltdown. I'm Gaia. I'm the head of technology and human rights at the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. I have a mix of different places, but I'm from India. I live in Mauritius, but at the moment I'm in Switzerland. Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to the discussions.
Thank you. Thank you both. Okay, so just a technical difficulty to announce. Fadi Quran, our final panelist, is having some tech issues. He'll hopefully be joining us soon. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and just introduce the subject matter for the panel. The world has witnessed significant geopolitical changes in the last decade, which have resulted in new issues entering the arena that have contributed to a decline in addressing the Palestinian cause in all of its manifestations. However, events in Palestine over the last 2 years have emphasized the importance and centrality of the Palestinian cause, restoring its presence in all arenas. It was remarkable that the digital space and communication platforms witnessed a high level of solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians, prompting Hamla Center to dedicate an entire theme to digital solidarity. And in this Palestine Digital Activism Forum of 2023, given the importance of solidarity in the face of violations and systematic digital discrimination against Palestinians and oppressed peoples and societies. This important case, which must be accumulated, necessitates giving it another space to contribute to its expansion and development. And this is what this session will work on, which is to create a discussion and interaction among Palestinians regarding the issues of other oppressed peoples and societies in order to discuss the possibilities of collective action that seeks to overcome the effects of digital discrimination and holding these companies and governments involved in it accountable. Looks like while I was reading that session description, Fadi has joined us. Fadi, please take a second to introduce yourself, and then I'll go ahead and guide the conversation from there.
Thank you, and sorry for the delay. I had some technical issues. My name is Fadi Quran, and I'm a campaign director at Avaz, which is a global organization with about 70 million members. And I lead our work on digital rights and fighting disinformation across the world, including seeking ways to hold the tech platforms accountable for their oppression of different vulnerable communities across the globe. And it's good to be with all of you today.
Thank you so much, Fadi. Okay, wonderful. So for our community joining us today, I'll just go over the structure a bit and we'll get started. We have at the beginning a moderated conversation, and so we have some pre-developed questions that I'll pose to our panelists and get a good vibe going back and forth. And then we're going to go to some Q&A from those joining us, the audience. And so I'll ask the audience to please place your questions in the chat, and we'll be able to get to those when we get to the Q&A session. So thank you again for joining us, everyone. I want to get us right into the conversation, and I'll start with Gaia. Gaia, what sort of discriminatory issues are communities across the global South dealing with when it comes to big tech?
Thank you. Let me sort of provide some context around this, right? The Business and Human Rights Resource Center draws attention to the social and environmental impact of over 10,000 companies across the world. What we do is track news and reports on negative impacts of tech companies, more specifically my team, does that. And then we write to tech companies about these specific allegations, asking them to respond. Now, over the years, we've registered about 860 pieces of news or reports relating to rights violations by tech companies only in the MENA region. Out of these 860 pieces, we've actually written to tech companies about the MENA region 50 times. There have been 50 specific allegations we've written to companies about. Now, out of this larger number, 22 pieces of news or reports relate to Palestine, and 3 allegations relate to specific instances to companies on isolated or direct impact on Palestinians. Now, that kind of provides a picture of what is the basis of this assessment. I think the key issue really lies with the lack of inclusion of Global South voices in different aspects throughout the life cycle of a tech product, and not going far enough in terms of offering remedies, in terms of actually implementing remedies. Now, the Global South perhaps continues to be viewed merely as a market for most of the big tech companies, which are essentially domiciled in the Global North. Thus, the benefits, that's basically the profits, accrue from the South, but ultimately and disproportionately enriches the companies that are based in the Global North. Decision making clearly stems from the North, right? Quite often we hear employees in these companies and civil society reporting sort of a lack of agency in either making the decision or influencing this decision. In terms of remedies, maybe we can look at a specific example which we covered in our database. Booking.com, in relation to listings on their website, was able to issue a warning, essentially a sticker that said that this particular booking, this particular hotel, this particular property is in the occupied area. Now, this is a step, no doubt, but this response was not enough. This was not sufficient enough of a response. And even to get tech companies to do just that much, it takes so much advocacy, it takes so much resources and time of civil society from the Global South. Another issue really relates to attacks against HRDs, which is clearly not as prevalent in the Global North. At the same time, these companies are not doing enough on this front. Similarly, surveillance technology is sold by these companies in the North and are predominantly used to target people in the Global South. However, there have been clear instances where these technologies have also been used against people in the North, which perhaps is prompting the issuance of newer regulations, newer guidances that we are seeing. Now, unlike the North, it feels a little bit like big tech companies have an opaque bilateral relationship with states, whether they're democratic or otherwise. For the most part, this bilateral relationship is with the exclusion of civil society. So we don't really know what is the dealing between the state and the private sector, what are the adjustments that are being made, concessions being offered. We really don't know. In our recent research called Dismantling the Facade, a Global South Perspective on Stakeholder Engagement, we found that interviewees consistently expressed that they do not feel as heard or as seen as their Global North counterparts. But in a nutshell, not having enough space to influence how a product is designed, not getting access to decision makers in the companies when issues come up, and the lack of accountability or consequences for negatively impacting the lives of people in the Global South, I think that really is the difference.
Thank you so much, Gaia. I mean, the contextualization is so critical, particularly for those of us situated in the US and who see ourselves as advocates on the cause. Inez and Fadi, I'm going to come over to you now. How do these problems manifest themselves for Palestinians? Inez, let's start with you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think for us, I'll speak like our experience at the PIPD Rabit. We are among an ecosystem of organizations who I think use the digital space, social media very actively to both create, we create content and we also conduct campaigns. And we directly, are trying to hold Israel accountable. And so I think there's very obvious things that I think we've said in this forum before, but I think I think we've made some breakthrough in the past years, I think in terms of digital presence as Palestinians, which with that has come tremendous hurdles and I think pushback from an Israeli system that is very heavily, I think, equipped both the government authorities and affiliated NGOs, or what they call themselves NGOs, but sort of organizations that are proactively trying to smear and take down content. So how I think what are the really I think key challenges we've seen is that clearly now social media algorithms, etc., are playing against us. I think a lot of us in our ecosystem experience shadow banning, and it's very hard still, I think, to fight shadow banning because it's not like your content is taken down. It's rather than anything related to Palestine these days, anything slightly political or what the algorithm will see as political will be proactively sort of shadow banned, meaning has much less outreach. The other thing is things like the content being deemed for a certain age, so it will be sort of deemed as sensitive content. I think that's extremely serious because again we see again and again and again that the simple fact of being Palestinian, of the Palestinian identity, is deemed sensitive to certain audiences, and that means that there is Israeli authorities, there is an Israeli regime that proactively is working on these companies, is working on the narrative in order to basically say that any Palestinian is an anti-Semite or is a terrorist, and so kind of framing things in a way that basically our mere existence is deemed as something sensitive that can offend someone, and so that's what we're dealing with. And so I think part of also what we have to invest in and what we're investing in is beyond social media. I think we all have, and start to realize that, yes, we do need social media, but we also need to organize in different ways. And so digital media goes beyond social media. I think, a lot of us use WhatsApp a lot. But I think there as well, because it's meta, a lot of us feel insecure on WhatsApp and on how our conversations are monitored or not. We use email. I think we invest more and more in emails. There is like Signal. I mean, there is also, I think, different apps that are not social media that are extremely important to organize and to build connection, solidarity, where I think now it's clear that Instagram, Twitter, and other platforms are really, I think, limiting what we can do. And I think because I'll stop there, and I think we'll discuss later, because I think this session is about how do we connect with other solidarity movements, and I think that's a central part of the user experience as well.
Yeah, thank you, Inez. We're excited to get into that portion of the conversation, but we'll hand it over to Fadi here first.
Thank you. And I'll just add also a little bit more context, broadly speaking, about how we as Palestinians sometimes face things, but actually other communities are facing the exact same things. So in Palestine, one of the largest challenges we faced is the use of certain terminology. For example, the word shaheed, which means martyr. In Palestine, there are martyrs almost every day. And yet it became clear that there were certain policies within Facebook or Meta-owned platforms, but also more broadly, that when that terminology was used, the accounts using it would be shadow banned. And it turns out actually that it's not just Palestinians that are facing shadow banning for using this terminology. There are also communities in Kashmir, for example, and communities in Pakistan and elsewhere that have been facing similar types of shadow banning for using that term. And I want to take this context also to speak about another community that's been a big victim of the social media platforms, and mainly Facebook, which is the Rohingya community. And in Palestine, we speak about the Nakba, where over 750,000 people were displaced from their homes. The Rohingya faced their own Nakba, where over 700,000 of them were displaced from their homes, and many hundreds and thousands were massacred and raped. And Facebook played a key role in amplifying the hatred that put fuel to this genocide. And there are now members of the Rohingya community that are going after Facebook. But even until today, this community has not been really protected from attacks that they faced on social media platforms. And you can compare some of the attacks they face to some of the attacks that and discrimination Palestinians face from settlers and so forth on social media platforms. And there's another important example, which is if you go to Ethiopia and the conflict in the Tigray region, where there are disinformation tactics right now used by certain actors there to, when massacres happen in that region by different governments, the disinformation campaigns seek to make it so that those massacres didn't happen. And social media platforms have proven to be unwilling and unable largely to protect these communities from that type of disinformation, and that is covering up these huge massacres. And it's also similar to what we as Palestinians face when you have actors like NGO Monitor, etc., that use online tactics to claim that we have not faced massacres, for example, what happened in Nablus recently or elsewhere, and to reframe in a false narrative what's happening to us. And I say this because for the Palestinian audience here particularly, sometimes it may feel like we are the ones being targeted and we're kind of singled out, but we're really not. Other people, other vulnerable and oppressed communities are facing the exact similar types of discrimination that we face. And I want to take it one step higher, which is to say, when we look at all this oppression that's being amplified and in some cases enforced by these social media platforms, what we see is that there are three main actors. There are the ethno-nationalist and far-right groups. Think of the Moody's, think of the Trumps, the Orbans of the world, etc. And these are certain groups who are using social media to create this large public narrative that targets certain communities and seeks to displace or destroy or ethnically cleanse them. And the social media platforms are not protecting its users against these types of actors and that type of narrative. And then the second terms of bad actors are the kind of capitalistic narrative actors, which within this, operate within the social media platform sphere. And largely their arguments are very consistent with this point of view. We hear this sometimes from Elon Musk and others, which is a reframing of the idea of freedom of speech on the platforms, which of course we all protect. And I would argue Palestinians face the most forms of censorship of any other people. But there's a reframing of that argument to claim that freedom of speech means freedom of reach to the worst actors so that they can use this technology to harm other peoples because that's good for business interests. And the platforms have fallen into that also framing. And so when we look at the big picture here, it's important for all of us to keep in mind that there are strong alliances between the different forces that are seeking to oppress us and silence our voices across the world. And it's on us to challenge them. And it's not just those two actors, there are many more. But I'll stop here and we can get into the details in the next section.
Yeah, that's a wonderful transition. Thank you, Fadi. Much appreciated. Gaia, we're going to come back to you here. BHRRC recently published a piece about communities across the Global South working for corporate accountability. Can you share some examples from that work? How have you seen communities from around the world work together and learn from each other's struggles and successes?
See me and hear me? Okay.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you for that question. Okay. This research that I referenced and I shared in the chat looks at the current challenges in advocating with tech companies for members from the Global South communities and for organizations in the Global South. Looks at what are the strategies that are currently being deployed by us and what is the way forward from wherever we are at this moment. Overall, the assessment was that there are clearly several examples where people have come together, really come up with coordinated campaigns, and advocacy initiatives, but perhaps more connections and coordination is needed. There may be groups that have gender expertise, some have the mobilizing power, some have the methodological expertise, while some other might have critical data, right? And some groups may have the real ability to reach out to decision makers or key actors like regulators or companies. It's really the coming together of these different stakeholder groups, different actors, different expertise, different perspectives that really makes a movement strong, or really kind of puts up a formidable fight, right? The corporate accountability and digital rights movements, therefore, kind of need to mutually reinforce each other to prop up that formidable fight that I was referring to. So the traditional sort of knowledge that we've developed over years, if not centuries, about labor rights, about the ability to push back against oil, against mining companies, against garment factory companies that, essentially violate different regulations. How did we go about that? And how did we go about campaigning there? How did we go about coordinating there, right? I think there's a lot to learn from there. And then there is expertise from the digital rights specific camps that provide sort of key insight into the digital. I think somehow the coming together of these two expertises is what is needed. There are some key examples, of course, including those that we recorded in the research. And one of the cases that Fadi referenced is in relation to Myanmar and Rohingyas. And another example I want to talk about is something from India. Now, in the case of Myanmar, Facebook was made to become somewhat accountable, to change its way for its complicity in the situation of Rohingyas, for the way it not only allowed, but in some cases even amplified hate on its platforms. Now, the way people came together here is actually an interesting story, and I invite you to take a read, because I think definitely 2018 and what happened with Meta and the Rohingya crisis and the international response to that is a defining moment in corporate accountability movement of the tech sector. Now, in this case, the civil society in Myanmar was able to execute a tremendously coordinated effort, which was built on data, which was built on consistent monitoring of violations on the platform, persistent outreach, and being able to build key relationship with actors such as the media and the UN, among other aspects, right? Of course, the UN stepping in, making a statement that Facebook was complicit in the situation and genocide of Rohingyas, really was able to provide the civil society efforts with the kind of visibility that was lacking. In this case, civil society and people across different sectors were able to come together, and people with expertise in the Rohingya situation, people who had expertise in migration and conflict, people who had expertise in digital and hate campaigning, all of them came together to kind of make this particular effort a success. Another interesting example that perhaps is worth also taking into note, it's a few years old, but it's still one of my favorite examples, is the net neutrality initiative, Save the Internet campaign that happened in India. It's a campaign that went viral and resulted in companies sort of backing off from thinking about introducing sort of differentiated internet, where some platforms would have had a preferential access, right? Now, this campaign involved essentially, I would say, two of the companies that were mainly at the receiving end of this campaign were Facebook and Airtel, which is a telecommunications company in India. This campaign had over 1 million people participating in some form or the other. The campaign saw mass mobilization of people, users, influencers, artists, comedians, experts, all of them sort of pulling in relatable information, being able to talk to a wider audience, being able to communicate complex technological issues in an understandable way. And what ultimately happened is that the regulator, came out with a statement in favor of net neutrality, and this really is an important success. Well, these are some publicly visible examples, right? But coordination and solidarity takes many forms and many sizes, many shapes, and we witness it every day when groups come together, take on violations, pushback against power. The examples are endless. And just to wrap up, I actually view my job that happens every day as a form of solidarity, because what I do and what my team does is that we support civil society, we support users who have a specific allegation against a tech company or have a report that backs up their allegations. And if they do not get a response from tech companies, then we reach out to tech companies with this credible report saying, why haven't you responded? Now, this is one form of solidarity. Another form of solidarity is really this corporate accountability movement is a spectrum, right? You have different expertise coming in. Now, for example, groups like Ranking Digital Rights, kind of monitoring different points of violation, writing to companies, asking them for responses, and then ranking them. That also provides a resource for civil society. So I think solidarity happens in different forms, and it's just a question of how do we strengthen it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we know solidarity when we see it, because we can feel it. But thank you for that, Gaia. Ines and Fadi, going to come to you now. Can you all share recent examples of how Palestinians have engaged in global solidarity to hold both corporations and governments accountable? Maybe.
Fadi, do you want to start this time?
Thank you, Ines. So some of the examples of solidarity that I would pull out just from recent days relate to what's happening in Sudan. And I want to note that in 2021, when the Palestinians had the Unity Uprising, the Sheikh Jarrah events, the war on Gaza, and we were facing this massive censorship campaign from social media platforms, many of the Sudanese activists, human rights movements, speakers in Sudan and across the world played a key role in helping get the voices of Palestinians to spread and be shared, not just across Africa, but across the world. And similarly, when we recently had the heartbreaking civil war that's going on in Sudan right now, we saw many Palestinian influencers, civil society activists sharing and spreading the stories and content and demanding solidarity with the Sudanese people in terms of what they are facing and the violence that they are facing. And it would be no surprise to anyone here to also note that some of the parties that are responsible for this breakdown in Sudan are close allies and connected with the Israeli regime. But this type of, I want to call it the liberation dance, where you have one community that's facing massive oppression, not just from their governments, but where social media platforms are also playing a negative role in silencing them and censoring them. You have another community rise up and amplify their voices and kind of share lessons. That's why recently, when the situation in Gaza escalated again, we saw Sudan Anonymous come into play and actually engage in certain disruptive, activist cyber campaigns vis-a-vis certain Israeli infrastructure projects in support of the Palestinian cause. But it's not just Sudan where we see this type of solidarity. There's a kind of broader example where we're seeing Palestinians that have expertise in this space, that have because they faced Israeli technology, which is the technology of suppression now used and abused by social media platforms and other places. Palestinians are going across the world, whether it's to Ethiopia or to Brazil when the elections were happening there and elsewhere, and kind of training their compatriots on how to avoid not just social media's discriminatory tactics, but the broader technologies that exist. And I think it's happening organically. It's not a very coordinated solidarity effort. It's kind of happening from the gut at the moment. Some of it is coordinated, but for the most part, it's happening on an instinctive human level. But the power and the impact of it that it could have if it was more coordinated and expanded on would be huge, because I think the realization people in our space are getting is that this is not a lonely battle that each one of us has to fight alone. It's a collective battle that we can't win unless we fight it together. And I'll hand over to Ines, who can maybe speak about a few more examples in this space.
Yeah, and I think there is a lot more that we could actually do. And I think part of the challenge that we have in this is I think the digital space is where we can be connected, because geographically, a lot of us, and a lot of Palestinians cannot travel. The same for Sudanese or Rohingyas. And I think I do humbly believe that Palestinians can do better in learning from other struggles in building such solidarity. I think actually we've not been great at it always. And I think it's also the strength, because we have such also, like also the Sudanese and other nations, we have a large diaspora and people in exile. And I think that's, the strengths that, for example, you, Ahmed, in the US, I think the Palestinians, the Palestinian American, you've been able to create really that intersectionality, that sort of these bridges with other people's causes, that I think also we Palestinians in Palestine can definitely learn more and connect more. I think that's definitely a need. When it comes to, I think, holding corporations and governments accountable, I think the very obvious case that I wasn't closely involved in, but comrades were, is Pegasus, right? I think and this is where I think our strength is exposing some of these harmful actors and taking them down, because Israel, as Fadi said, is really, I think it's still not fully recognized that Israel is a harmful actor in all of this. And what we've seen, after actually the Pegasus exposure, and actually Palestinian human rights defender being at the center of being, revealing like how they were hacked, and then many sort of other people in other countries. The fact of the matter is that if you look at investigations, if you look at, for example, the European Parliament looking into it, often it's almost like this company comes from nowhere. It is incubated by an occupation, by a military occupation, and these harmful technologies. It's Pegasus is only the tip of the iceberg, and recently it was the disinformation team Jorge that was also revealed by investigative journalists. I think there is a tremendous power that we can build around who is targeted by these instruments. I just saw a report by two Moroccan journalists who are also living in exile from the Moroccan government, who have exposed sort of a Moroccan branch of the Team Jorge disinformation network. I think these are extremely powerful example of how we basically are after the same networks, the same powerful actors that are extremely harmful for all of our existence and values. And I think what we need to build is, how do we actually build those connections in, as I think Gayatri said, like each one of us have different strengths, right? Some of us are good at media, others are good at research, others are good at like tech. And I think like it's how can we sort of organically, but also in an organized way, without becoming, also we can become huge bureaucracies or systems, but making sure that we can build on each other's strengths to go after these actors. And so I think these few successes, I think what we need to build on is where they come from. Because again, they don't fall from the sky. It's not like they're out of nowhere. It's how they connect to each other, and how basically repressive regimes are buying these tools, how they're developing these tools, and I think often the people struggles. I think often we have to come together after these actors, and it's not always that natural. Because also, the online space being so polarized, we also have not to be naive that, there are, I've seen also sort of causes creating rift and creating division. And so I think this is also where this is our challenge to work on, is like when it was the Syrian revolution and the civil war, or the Iranian, population, and now women sort of uprising. There is no consensus among our societies and in the online space. And these these regimes have very powerful sort of bot farms and sort of trying to also play divisions, which I think sometimes unfortunately works, because we've seen influencers like Palestinian influencers being also sort of attacked on many sides, and it's not genuine. It's often by I think just illegitimate or bots or different actors. But I think that's also something we really need to pay attention to, because it sows division. And I know we Palestinians have a lot of discussions about that, but I'm sure it happens. We've seen that happening in Iran and in other places where, in a time of repression and oppression, obviously divide and conquer is the policy that your enemy is using, and I think it sometimes unfortunately works. And I think that's also how we have to be, again, increasing solidarity, increasing the education around these issues, and increasing our learning, both from other people, but also from the mistakes and the successes of others.
Thank you so much, Inez. So look, everyone, we've spent a little bit of time discussing the problem. We've talked about examples of solidarity, and we're going to spend these next few minutes talking about the way forward. Of course, after this, we'd love to get to some question and answer. So please, again, populate the chat if you have some questions for our brilliant panelists. But to wrap us up here, so this question will be to each of you, and I think we'll start with you, Gaia, again. But from your experience doing this work, what are some of the biggest opportunities for further global solidarity in holding powers to account when it comes to digital discrimination? What needs to be done to take advantage of those opportunities? Please, with your last couple of minutes, if you could each touch on that question.
Yeah, I think there are two things here. One is external sort of opportunities, and another is what we need to do internally, right? I think that externally, the falling profits of tech companies, the fact that there is going to be a lot more European legislation. We've seen examples from the US where the state is cracking down on surveillance technology being sold. I think these are all opportunities for us external opportunities to capitalize on, is to really be able to influence the discussions in these different spaces to make sure human rights for all are protected. Now, when it comes to internally, what is it that we can do? The research sort of identifies 4 broad areas, and Ines has already spoken about this. Is the first thing is we need to build evidence, and we need to build consistent evidence, and we need to build it in a way across organizations that are able to show data that can speak to each other. So I think A is building credible, irrefutable evidence, consistent evidence. That's number one. Number 2 is, what do we do then, right? Is for us to be able to build our capacity to take on big tech companies and not so big tech companies, being able to have the skill to identify the right strategy, to be able to put the right kind of pressure, to be able to display the right kind of data at the right moment, really being able to build our capacity to take on corporate accountability, to be able to showcase that we know exactly what we're saying, we have data to back it up, and who and how we engage companies, different strategies we use. That's on capacity building. Now, once we have those 2 down, I think the most important thing is coordination. And Ines talked about this as well. How do we make sure that we coordinate with like-minded groups, and maybe even not so like-minded groups? Because we don't have to necessarily agree on everything, as long as our fundamentals are right, as long as the point is that human rights must be protected. Surely there are different ways in which we can coordinate, and so that there's no duplication of efforts, so that everybody is stronger together. And the last really point I would say is resourcing. And I'm not just talking about making sure that we have enough financial resources. I'm talking about making sure that the human resources are strong enough, that the resources we produce are strong enough, and that we are able to share the information that we have with our own networks. Even, for instance, knowing which part of a company to reach out to, who in that company is responsible for decision making or undoing a particular policy. Just knowing that in itself is a resource.
Thank you so much, Gaia. Okay, Inez, we'll come to you, and then we'll have Fadi wrap us up before we go to Q&A.
Yeah, I think I mean definitely I agree with Gayatri. I think the the existence, I think for us, like obviously partners like Hamle, Access Now, and I think those who are sort of focusing on digital rights is super important because they're creating a lot of partnerships and ties with other international, other national organizations that are working on going after protecting digital rights and going after for digital corporate accountability, etc. And so I think like we rely a lot on them, and they rely on us for again content, evidence, and then support for any sort of campaigns where we can then kind of bring about our campaigning expertise and more like mobilization of our people. So I think these, I think like the existence of such sectorial organizations and who are focusing on the topic is extremely important, and I think it creates further opportunities for us, and it's us as users who have the responsibility to also bring about the different issues that we're facing when it comes to campaigning, advocacy, etc. And so in a lot of our work, I mean, clearly, I think what we're seeing in terms of opportunities for further coordination is how do we best exchange information? In a time where I think we're in a world where there's so much information out there. Often the issue is how do we not get caught into our echo chamber, into our bubble? And I think this is the biggest challenge and opportunity is. It's basically through, again, not only social media, but different sort of ways of connecting with each other through private messaging apps, through email, and, offline also meeting, because we can meet again in person for when we can travel, etc. These are extremely important for us to create these organic ways of exchanging information and avoid duplication. And I think this is what I see is the most efficient. Like, for example, we are a team of 7 people, and that's small. But obviously, our impact is not possible without the ecosystem we're creating, with making sure that we have created a sort of organic network that we can tap into. And I think this is, this is basically like the sort of more grassroots level of what the UN should do, right? The UN is about all these states talking to each other and meeting each other, and but it has become such a monster bureaucracy that I think we as civil society and activists and researchers, academics and whatever, I think the fact that we can have the agility to build different networks that can be labeled or non-labeled. I think I've seen this really develop over the past years. In forms of different coalitions, in forms of different working groups that I think are actually extremely efficient at advancing things together. Sometimes it's just a Google group or, an email where someone is sharing, and then there's like 200 people in that email chain, and then people will say, oh, but that guidelines and that resource, we actually did it, and you don't know who's in that list, but you just know it's a community of people working on a certain type of issue that affects us all. And so I think these kind of tools, I think we should, capitalize on and learn more. I think like often we experiment a lot, and we don't sort of consolidate and capitalize on what we've experimented. So I think this is what the opportunity we have is maybe to in terms of tools, not only speaking about the topic, the issue, like digital rights or going after that digital company or that algorithm, but also what are these organizing tools and campaigning tools and teach-ins that we can have with each other on what are the things that work and don't work in terms of building collective power.
And I'll jump into to say, first of all, let's not lose the big picture here, which is that the reason we're fighting to have a voice on these social media platforms, the reason we're seeking accountability in this space is not because it's good or healthy to be on Facebook or Instagram and so forth. In fact, for everyone listening in, I'll say the less you spend time on these apps, the better for you and probably your community and your loved ones. The reason, though, that we are fighting for this space is because right now there is a global struggle for defining the narratives that explain to people how to see and engage the world, right? Is the narrative that people see one where we're speaking about Israel as an apartheid state that's colonizing and displacing another people that needs to be held accountable and people need to act to support it? Or is the narrative people are seeing a false narrative about Israel being a democracy and so forth? And I would first and foremost call on all of us to think about what are the asymmetric tactics, the strategies that we can use to ensure that our narrative, our truthful narrative that's in pursuit of freedom and justice and dignity for all in Palestine, but all across the world as well, is the narrative that succeeds. And doing that is where we should then design, achieving that goal is how we should design our strategy moving forward. And holding these platforms accountable is part of that puzzle. But in fact, what may be more productive and useful in the short to medium term is actually us figuring out how to create an international digital resistance network or brigade, which is a network of people, oppressed people across the world, where they can come together and find ways to amplify their voices and find ways to go around the algorithms that are seeking to silence us and redesign their architecture through that broad work. Because in an internal study we found that in 2021, for example, there were over 300 million people that were posting about Palestine. There are only 12 million Palestinians across the world, right? And so how can we tap into those voices and that network? And I would say that's the big picture battle that we really need to engage in. Now, in terms of the corporate accountability angle, there are steps, that were mentioned on this call that are important. There are two steps I would add to them. The first is, I would say, we need to be really targeting and engaging the employees of these tech platforms, because they're going to be a main source of leaks that's going to allow us to take these platforms to court and embarrass them and actually show the evidence of the harm they're doing. So figuring out tactics to go directly to the employees, many of whom are already sympathetic to our cause, is crucial. And then the second path to corporate accountability is really thinking about what are the ways that we can create, powerful lawsuits against these companies, and finding ways to do that where we can find victims of certain harms from these companies, but that are coming from different places. So if we can get a person from the Amazon and a person from the U.S. South, where we haven't spoken, but also Americans, African Americans, Hispanics, etc., are also victims of different forms of silencing on these networks that Palestinians face. And if we can then get someone from India, and someone from South Africa and someone from Palestine who have faced the exact same harm, and bring strategic litigation against the companies in mainly the US, because that's where some of them are based, but the EU also offers opportunities. I think that could be a powerful way to kind of begin to shake these platforms as solid ground, and to ensure that they know that people around the world are not going to be silenced by them. But the first step I would start is really just redesigning this digital resistance network, an international network of people that can figure out very quickly with agility how to surpass the platform's censorship tactics. Because this is an ongoing battle, it's an urgent battle, and we unfortunately don't have the luxury to wait. We need to win the corporate accountability battles, but we don't have the luxury to wait until we achieve those victories. And so we need countermeasures in the short term as well.
Thank you, Fadi, Inez, and Gaia. I mean, this was a wonderful conversation. In the comments, I did not see any questions raised, but there was a compliment to this being an excellent discussion with important points. So thank you all so much. I think since there are no questions posed, what I'll do is just give you all an opportunity to say any final words, anything you didn't get to, and briefly, so that we can wrap this, but give you all a little bit more space. So Inez, anything in closing that you'd like to share?
I think just emphasizing what I think Gaia and Fadi said about resources, and I think thinking about strategic litigation. This is something that we speak a lot about with some of our partners who are building such litigation. It does require resources, and so I think it's asymmetrical strategies is also where we can sort of create the breaches and sort of create the cracks and make, I think, these corporations and government uncomfortable, because holding someone accountable is also, making sure that they feel the pressure. And so definitely sort of putting our resources, not only financial and non-financial, in common is definitely for me, the key. And making sure we continue to build across these different networks. So I'm glad I'm participating, in a panel that also is beyond Palestine, and we have someone else from somewhere else in Palestine to create these long-term solidarity with.
Thank you, Inez. And I think we just have another minute, but Gaia or Fadi, any final thoughts to share?
I'll just say that the AI kind of race and AI platforms, technologies, and so forth are just beginning, but we're seeing a huge growth in that space as well. And I think that's where a lot of people are going to start getting their information from, one way or another. And I think we shouldn't wait. I mean, we've already seeing how the data used, and Timnit Gibru and other researchers have shown how these AI, ChatGPT, etc., are discriminatory already and have a lot of issues. But I would say we shouldn't wait until another Rohingya genocide or another Palestine censorship campaign happens before we engage. I think this is another area where we need to start investing quickly and get ahead of the game instead of trying to play defense when we've lost it. And I'll just add that to the audience here and say, for those interested in this broader idea of an international digital resistance network, there's some thinking happening around that. And so feel free to reach out to me, and we can involve you, because this is a decentralized process seeking to bring as many people as possible into this space. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you all so much. Gaia, I hate to cut it short, but it looks like we've run out of time. Thank you everyone for joining us, and congratulations again to Hamle on this wonderful convening.
Thank you. Bye.